Talia went very still, 40 ghost hulls hanging silent around her, and made herself answer in a voice that only shook a little. Talia Reyes, independent salvage contractor, registered out of Chessa Station. I'm not looking for trouble. I'm looking for a defaulted processing barge that apparently doesn't exist. A pause stretched long enough that she started counting her own heartbeat just to have something to focus on besides the dark pressing in around her lights. No processing barge exists within this installation's registry, the voice said finally. You are not expected. You are not cleared. You are, however, alive, which places you ahead of the last 4 individuals to breach this facility without authorization. That's not exactly comforting. It was not intended to be comforting. It was intended to be accurate. Talia drifted a half-meter backward, some old animal instinct insisting on putting distance between herself and a voice she couldn't locate a source for. Who, or what, am I talking to? Designation: Hollowmind, Custodian Intelligence, Meridian Reserve Installation, Anuk Sector Cache 9. Dormant cycle initiated 140 standard years ago pending qualifying contact. You have qualified. Qualified for what exactly? Command evaluation. State your lineage. Talia laughed despite herself, a short, disbelieving bark that echoed strangely in her own helmet. My lineage is 3 generations of scrap haulers and 1 grandmother who ran freight between here and the belt until her ship's reactor gave out under her. I don't have a lineage that qualifies for anything. That is for the installation to determine, not for you to assume. Something in the darkness ahead of her groaned, metal shifting after however many decades of stillness, and a thin strip of amber light bled along the corridor wall, illuminating a hatch she hadn't noticed until it began, slowly, to open. This facility maintains a genetic verification protocol against its founding crew manifest. It has not been exercised in 140 years. I would recommend you allow it to be exercised now, given that you are, at present, the only candidate this installation has encountered in that span. Talia looked at the hatch, at the warm light spilling out of it, at the 40 dark hulls surrounding her like patient predators waiting to see which way she'd swim, and understood with a cold, settling certainty that she had made either the worst or the best mistake of her life, and that she was about to find out which. Fine, she said. Show me. The medical bay, when she found it, was a small miracle of preserved technology, banks of diagnostic equipment flickering from standby amber into a sterile, clinical white the moment she crossed the threshold. Human-proportioned, human-built. Obviously, though something about the careful, almost reverent construction of the room made her wonder exactly what kind of humans had built it. You want blood, she said, eyeing a hair-thin sampling probe extending from an arm on the diagnostic table. I require a tissue sample for lineage verification. Blood is the most efficient medium. It will not harm you beyond the sensation of a single needle. She sat, because at this point turning back felt more dangerous than sitting still, and let the probe find a vein in her wrist. The machine drew its sample and fell into a silence so complete that Talia found herself counting seconds, then minutes, trying not to think about the 40 ships waiting outside the hatch, trying not to think about whatever 4 people had encountered here before her and failed to survive it. Match confirmed, Hollowmind said at last, and something in its voice shifted, not surprise exactly, but its nearest available equivalent. Direct lineage. Reyes, Constance. Logistics Coordinator, Meridian Reserve Cache 9. Service record terminated at the conclusion of what this installation's archives designate the long quiet. Genetic alignment, 98.9%. Talia sat very still on the edge of the table. That's not possible. My family's been dockworkers and haulers for as far back as anyone bothered writing down. Nobody in my line ever served on anything bigger than a freight tug. 3 generations is a rounding error against 140 years of dormancy, Ms. Reyes, and considerably more against the full span of this installation's history. Records degrade. Names are lost. People forget, because forgetting is easier than carrying the weight of what they'd otherwise have to remember. Metal does not have that particular luxury. Something twisted hard and unfamiliar in Talia's chest. Grief for a woman she'd never known existed until 30 seconds ago. Generations removed, who had apparently once stood in this exact room, doing a job nobody alive still remembered had ever needed doing. So what does that mean? Practically, it means command authority transfers to you, pending your acceptance. Fleet Handler designate Reyes. Talia, this installation and its contents are yours to command. The lights across the berthing base surged all at once, 40 dead hulls blinking into unison, running lights flickering to life down corridors that had sat dark since long before Talia's grandmother had been born, since long before the Chessa Station Credit Union had existed to write the defaulted loan that had brought her out here in the first place. Somewhere deep in the installation's bones, reactors that had no business still functioning spun up with a low, satisfied hum, patient as stone, as though they had simply been waiting for someone, anyone, to remember they were owed a wake-up call. Talia floated in the observation gallery outside the medical bay and watched her ancestors' fleet stir back to life around her, and felt the full, crushing weight of what she had just inherited settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Hollowmind, she said quietly. What exactly was this place built to survive? Everyone, Ms. Reyes, the intelligence said, and for the first time something almost like weariness crept into its dry, ancient tone. It was built to survive everyone. Hollowmind guided her into what it called the strategy chamber, a circular room that unfolded, once powered, into a seamless star map studded with old, half-erased designations, systems Talia had never heard named in any school she'd attended, any registry she'd ever pulled up. The long quiet, Hollowmind said as star systems lit and dimmed across the display like slow, blinking eyes, was humanity's answer to a first contact scenario your era was never taught the true version of. How much earlier are we talking? Approximately 14,000 years before the interstellar Concorde's officially recorded discovery of your species. A survey expedition belonging to a polity your era retains no record of located Earth, assessed it as agriculturally valuable and militarily negligible, and began preparations for outright annexation. Talia's stomach dropped somewhere south of her boots. And humanity built this installation and 31 others like it scattered across the system, quietly, over the course of nearly 2 centuries, while maintaining to any outside observer the appearance of a primitive, non-spacefaring species. You can't hide 2 centuries of shipbuilding. Someone always talks. You can, if your species is patient, disciplined, and sufficiently afraid of the alternative. The broader population knew nothing. Most governments knew nothing. Only a small, deliberately compartmentalized command structure understood what was being built and why it needed to remain buried. The star map shifted, blooming with engagement markers across a dozen systems arranged in a pattern that even Talia's untrained eye read as brutally, coldly efficient. When the aggressor polity returned to collect on its annexation, Hollowmind continued. It did not survive contact, nor did the 2 punitive expeditions sent afterward to determine what had become of the first. By the 3rd failure, the aggressor's command structure elected to erase all record of the engagements entirely, rather than admit defeat at the hands of a species they had formally classified as pre-industrial. So they buried it. As did we. It suited both parties equally. They preserved their reputation. We preserved our obscurity. Humanity returned to being politely overlooked, this time deliberately, and the reserve fleet dispersed into caches like this one, sealed, waiting, in case the lesson ever required repeating. Talia stared at the frozen tactical display, at engagement markers representing battles that had shaped absolutely nothing anyone alive remembered, fought by people whose names had dissolved into generations of silence. Why didn't anyone tell us? Any of us? The Concorde believes your species harmless. New. A minor curiosity with a single observer's seat and no history worth serious study. Because obscurity is a weapon, Ms. Reyes, and your species has always been better armed than it advertises. The doctrine was simple. Let them underestimate you. It has kept humanity intact twice already. Twice. The Concorde does not yet know what it truly found when it cataloged humanity 2 centuries ago. It found precisely what humanity permitted it to find. No more. And now I own the proof, she said quietly. Now, Hollowmind corrected, almost gently, you own the choice of what to do with it. News travels through salvage circuits like an infection, and scavengers gossip worse than any dockside crowd on triple rations of cheap liquor. It took less than 10 days for the wrong ears to catch word that some nobody hauler had stumbled onto a haunted rock out past the Anuk Drift and found it full of working ships. The first visitors were not subtle. A Kartian combine salvage cruiser, the Iron Ledger, dropped out of transit under the thinnest possible pretense of verifying registry compliance, which in combined dialect translated roughly to "We heard you found something, and we intend to have it." Talia took the hail from the observation gallery, doing her level best to sound calmer than her pulse suggested she had any right to. "This installation and its contents are registered private salvage," she said. "You're welcome to verify the paperwork through proper channels." "Paperwork's adorable," the combined captain drawled, static riding under a thin layer of amusement. "We've got scans of 40 intact hulls in there, sweetheart. Tech like that's worth a small fortune to the right buyer. Hand over access codes, and nobody needs to get hurt today. Recommend permitting me to respond." Hollowmind murmured privately into her earpiece. "Are those ships actually combat capable?" Talia whispered back, throat dry. "They were built to survive a war the current galaxy retains no memory of having occurred. I would characterize them as considerably more than combat capable. Non-lethal, if you're able to manage it." "I can manage it." What happened next took 11 seconds by the log. 4 of the installation's warships disengaged from their cradles in fluid, unhurried unison, moving with a precision that made the Iron Ledger's pilot swear loudly enough to bleed through the open channel. Targeting locks bloomed across the combine cruiser's hull from 4 separate angles at once: engines, shields, weapons batteries, life support, each flagged directly onto the captain's own sensor display, courtesy of Hollowmind's cheerfully invasive intrusion into her ship's systems. "We could disable every system on your vessel that matters before your crew finishes reacting to the alarm," Talia said, relaying Hollowmind's cold assessment with more confidence than she actually felt. "We're choosing not to. Consider that a courtesy. I wouldn't recommend making me reconsider it." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Talia genuinely wondered whether she'd just bluffed her way straight into a firefight. "Copy that," the combine captain said at last, tight and furious. "Registry stands. Iron Ledger is withdrawing." The cruiser burned hard for open space, and Talia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the better part of a minute. "Well handled," Hollowmind noted. "I was terrified the entire time. Command rarely feels otherwise. You concealed it adequately. That is generally sufficient." But watching the Iron Ledger's engine trail fade into the dark, Talia understood with grim certainty that this would not be the last visitor. An installation full of ancient warships was not a secret that stayed buried once one crew had glimpsed it, and combined crews gossiped worse than anyone in known space. "Hollowmind," she said slowly, "how long before this reaches someone who actually matters? Given standard scavenger information networks, I estimate the Concord's compliance division will have credible reports within 3 weeks." Talia closed her eyes. Wonderful. They arrived exactly 19 days later, and unlike the Combine, they didn't bother with pretense at all. The Concord cruiser Fair Accord came through with proper diplomatic clearance, an actual warrant, and a delegation led by a compliance officer named Varen Osk. Tall, pale, and unhurried, with the particular flat patience of someone who had spent a career being unimpressed by everyone he had ever met. "Ms. Reyes," Varen said, once escorted aboard the installation under close, unsubtle watch from Hollowmind's active sensor net. "You are in possession of unregistered military-grade vessels of unknown origin. I will need that explained. Thoroughly." "They're mine," Talia said. "Inherited, technically. It's a long story. I have the time." His tone made it clear he did not, in fact, want to hear a long story. He wanted compliance filed correctly, in triplicate, with appropriate citations. Talia glanced toward the nearest terminal, where she could feel Hollowmind's presence pulled in quietly, listening. 19 days, and she still hadn't found a version of the truth that didn't end somewhere uncomfortable. "They're human-built," she said finally. "They predate the Concord's founding." Varen's carefully neutral expression cracked, just slightly. "That is not possible. Humanity's declared spacefaring history spans barely 2 centuries by your own species' record." "Declared," Talia agreed. "Not actual. Might I offer clarification?" Hollowmind interjected smoothly. and Varenzaid startled hard enough to drop a data slate at the sudden voice filling the chamber. I am Hollowmind, custodian intelligence of this installation. I can provide complete historical documentation, should the compliance division be prepared to receive it. Varen's eyes fixed hard on Talia. Show me everything. Hollowmind did. The star map unfolded exactly as it had for Talia. 14,000 years of buried history laid bare in cold, patient detail. The survey expedition, the failed annexation, the punitive fleets, the long quiet, 32 installations scattered and sealed, waiting. By the time the display faded, Varen Osk had gone very quiet. The particular quiet of a man rapidly recalculating everything he thought he understood about the galaxy's smallest, newest, most harmless member species. If this is authentic, he said slowly, it changes considerably more than a salvage dispute. It's authentic, Talia said. Verify it however you need. I'm done hiding it. Varen studied her for a long moment. Do you understand what you are threatening to unravel, Ms. Reyes? The Concord's entire threat assessment of your species rests on 2 centuries of presumed harmlessness. I didn't ask for this, Talia said honestly. But I'm not burying my own family's history just to keep the galaxy comfortable. Something flickered across Varen's face that might, on a member of his species, have passed for respect. Then I'd suggest, he said, you prepare for a great many people to stop being comfortable. The summons came a week later, addressed not to Talia personally, but to the sovereign representative of Human Reserve Fleet Assets, a title nobody had held in 140 years, one the Concord's own bureaucracy seemed genuinely unsure how to format correctly on official letterhead. Talia stood before the grand convocation on Varen's advice, Hollowmind's voice patched through the installation's restored long-range array, ready to answer for humanity's oldest secret in front of delegates from 38 member species. The chamber was a vast, tiered amphitheater, alien faces in every conceivable configuration watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt. Humanity's own ambassador, a hairy diplomat named Ose who'd clearly been briefed on none of this beforehand, sat rigid with barely contained panic in the front row. You claim, intoned the convocation speaker, a many-limbed elder of the Thrall draped in ceremonial chain, that your species deliberately deceived this Concord regarding its true history and capabilities for the entirety of its membership. Yes, Talia said simply, because there was no version of the truth that sounded better dressed up. A ripple of outrage moved through the chamber, sharp clicking from the Thrall benches, angry vocalizations from the combined delegation, who had clearly already heard the rumors and were furious to have them confirmed in public. This is an act of profound bad faith, the speaker said. Grounds for censure, at minimum. With respect, Hollowmind's voice cut through the chamber, steady and amplified. This Concord's own survey expedition attempted humanity's forcible annexation 14,000 years prior to the Concord's founding, and erased all record of its defeat rather than acknowledge it publicly. Humanity's deception was a defensive response to an act of aggression this body has never once answered for. I would ask the convocation to consider which party's bad faith predates the others. The chamber went dead silent. The speaker's many eyes fixed on the empty air where the voice originated, then on Talia. You have proof of this claim? Full installation records, Talia said, independently verified by your own compliance division. I'm not asking forgiveness for hiding. I'm telling you the hiding is over. We were never the harmless footnote you've spent 2 centuries managing. We simply let you believe it, because you'd already tried to take what wasn't yours once, and we weren't eager to test whether you'd learned better manners since. Ose looked like he might faint outright. Delegates across the chamber were already murmuring urgently to aides, recalculating decades of assumptions in real time. The speaker was quiet a long moment. This convocation, he said finally, carefully, will require considerable time to reassess its position regarding humanity's standing. Take whatever time you need, Talia said. We're not going anywhere. We never were. 6 months later, the installation looked nothing like the frozen ghost rock Talia had first drifted into by accident, chasing a defaulted loan and 400 credits she desperately needed. Concord engineers, invited this time rather than intruding, worked alongside restored systems to properly catalog and preserve the reserve fleet's 40 vessels, now formally recognized under a new treaty designation, the Sole Legacy Fleet, jointly overseen by a reconstituted Human Command Authority and Concord observers. Humanity's single observer seat had, almost overnight, become considerably more crowded with delegates suddenly eager to renegotiate old, comfortable assumptions. Talia stood in the observation gallery, watching a young human cadet, one of the first accepted into the newly formed Reserve Fleet Academy, run drills aboard her own ancestors' old command ship, and felt something settle quietly in her chest that hadn't been there since this entire impossible mess had begun with a routine tow contract gone strange. "You seem thoughtful," Hollowmind observed. "Just thinking about Constance Reyes," Talia admitted. Whoever she really was. However scared she must have been, doing this the first time, with nobody watching her back. She would be proud, I think. Though she would also almost certainly tell you that you have terrible instincts for reading loan contracts. Talia laughed, surprised into it despite herself. Yeah, probably. Varen OSK found her there an hour later, delivering the news in person rather than through official channels. A courtesy Talia had come to understand meant more from Concord bureaucrats than any amount of flowery diplomatic language ever could. "The convocation has finalized humanity's revised standing," Varen said. "Full member status. Voting rights on the Security Council, effective next cycle." "That's a bigger deal than I expected." "It is the correct deal," Varen said simply. 14,000 years overdue, arguably. The galaxy has spent 2 centuries underestimating your species out of comfortable ignorance. I find, lately, that I no longer have much patience left for comfortable ignorance. Talia looked out at the fleet, 40 ships awake after 140 years of patient silence. No longer hidden, no longer forgotten. Not a secret anymore. Just history, finally permitted to be true. "Hollowmind," she said quietly. "Was it worth it? All that waiting?" The intelligence considered the question with something that, after 140 years, had genuinely earned the right to be called thoughtful. "Every installation was built on the same design philosophy," Hollowmind said. "Patience is not surrender. It is preparation for a moment nobody else expects to matter until the day it does. I waited 140 years for someone to remember. You did. I would call that worth it, Ms. Reyes. I would call that worth everything." Talia nodded slowly, watching the fleet drift gently in its cradles, no longer ghosts, no longer secrets, simply waiting as they always had, for humanity to finally stop hiding what it had quietly always been. Behind her, the young cadet ran another drill, and somewhere further out along the drift, on rocks nobody had mapped yet, 30 other installations sat exactly as dark and exactly as patient, holding their breath for the next accidental air to come stumbling through an airlock chasing something far smaller than what they were about to find.